information about, I'm here to share information about the actual medical cannabis program in Utah, what the status is, and there's some recent updates you might have heard about the federal rescheduling of marijuana and how that impacts our program right now. I can cover that as well. And so I'll be hour number one, and then Dr. McIff will be hour number two. And as physicians and medical professionals, I'm sure you might find the clinical side a little more interesting. So I'll try to leave plenty of time for that discussion and for questions at the end so Dr. McIff can have a chance to share with you some of his clinical experience in this emerging field. So anyway, like I said, my name is Rich Oborn, and I'm excited to be here today to present. And we always have to start with a disclaimer, of course. My purpose here today is just to do some highlights of some of the laws that relate to medical cannabis in the state of Utah. And I'm going to outline some Utah laws, but it's not meant to be comprehensive. A complete copy of Utah's medical cannabis laws are available on the Utah Legislature's website. And you can go to that web address to learn more about those. And if you do have questions, you're welcome to contact our office. But if it requires some legal interpretation, of course, you'd have to talk to an attorney. But we don't expect, we won't get into any of that legal expertise today. But and I'm just sharing information today for informational purposes only. It's not intended to be legal advice or anything. So we're going to dive in. So as you may know, Utah has a legislative session once a year. There's some special sessions sometimes throughout, but the general session of the Utah legislature lasts from January to March. And this year, 2026, there was a major significant change to the medical cannabis administration, the way it's supposed to be administered. And that is that currently the duties of the program are in two separate agencies, in the Utah Department of Ag and Food, and then also the Utah Department of Health and Human Services. And what lawmakers decided to do is to move the responsibilities that are over at the Department of Health and Human Services over to the Utah Department of Ag and Food. So at the end of June 2026, all of the medical cannabis duties that are currently held by DHHS, where I work, are moving over to the Utah Department of Ag and Food. And so there will be one agency in the state of Utah that will be responsible for the medical program, and it still is medical only. And it'll be the Utah Department of Ag and Food that'll hold that responsibility. You may have heard also that Utah Department of Ag and Food received some responsibility over kratom and regulating that. So that's new for them. And they also regulate hemp as well. So that is one thing that'll be important. The transition of moving duties over to Department of Ag is ongoing, but it'll be completed by the end of June. So that's how things are moving now. Also, the legislative landscape across the United States changes over time, obviously. It's 2026, and there's a few states that are new to medical cannabis, such as Nebraska, Kentucky. That's now in green to represent that they're medical. And there's 24 states that have legalized recreational cannabis. Those are in orange. And if you'll notice, we continue to be surrounded, at least on the east and west and south, by states that are recreational. Each of those states also has a medical program. It's just not as big and common to be used. And then Idaho and Wyoming, they continue to have to not have programs that have medical cannabis allowed. And then there's a few states in addition to Idaho and Wyoming, a few others that are still don't have those laws that allow for state residents to use medical cannabis. Um, and still today, medical cannabis cannot cross state lines. If it has over 0.3% THC, there's still a requirement that it stay within the boundaries of that state. And here's just a slide that focuses on how the program has grown, and this just tells here we are as of today. So 113,202 patients registered in the program to legally possess and purchase medical cannabis in the state, and also gives you a flavor for how many are in each age group. So naturally, there's a major concern about youth getting access to medical cannabis or marijuana, right? And while the program has been operating for 7 or 6 years now, the program has grown to a point where there's still only about 70, well, under 21, 78 patients. And all of those youth and young adults who are under the age of 21 that have a medical cannabis card, they are all working with a medical provider that guides them, that tracks their use of medical cannabis, and they received a card only because a board of pediatricians and medical providers in the state reviewed the case, the petition presented by the medical provider, and they agreed that indeed medical cannabis is something that may help, and they all review evidence that the minor patient has used other more traditional treatments and they're not working, and so medical cannabis is a treatment that they all felt, yeah, this should be something that's an alternative medication that they could try and see if it worked better than the other traditional medications. So sometimes there's a misunderstanding that the program is giving all this access to youth and to young adults that are under 21, and that's actually not true. It's only a very, very small percentage of the program that that is used by that age of patients. One thing, though, is that youth do at times get access to products that are outside of the program, illegal products online or in the black market. And so those are things, of course, that's unfortunate. The black market has existed for several years. It continues to exist. But what we hope is that over time, law enforcement can address those situations appropriately, and that if there's someone that is a minor that's really in need, that they're able to work with their medical provider, assess if medical cannabis is right for them, and that the program is designed to help those legitimate cases. So also this shows the geographic distribution of where medical cannabis card holders exist in the state. And as you can see, they are in all counties throughout the state. There's not a county where there's not a medical cannabis card holder. And those that live in rural counties, obviously, they need to maybe drive a little further to go buy their medical cannabis, because there's only so many locations where you can buy it or have it delivered. But for those, they can have it delivered. So anyway, yeah.
That should brought down to
Uh-huh.
as you would expect, but is there much variation in terms of percent population accessing medical cannabis?
Yeah, that's an analysis that we've done, and it shows about the same. There's not a significant difference in the ratio. But if you were to give me your contact information, I can share it with you, and you could see what the analysis shows. We have a data analyst that looks at things like that. And what we do know is that in those rural, one thing I will say is that in a rural area where a medical cannabis pharmacy has opened up, like Price, that is the most rural area where medical cannabis pharmacy is opened up. They do have a higher percentage there, and mostly because the residents know, oh, okay, there's a location here, and they do advertising under the laws of the state, and people know about it, and it's easier to get to in price, right? And so anyway, yep, that's something to keep in mind. There's another question.
Yeah,
Just have you use the mic because maybe Zoom.
yeah, kind of in a similar vein. Do you have any data on the number of prescribers for those 113,000 and their distribution? Do you have a distribution map for the prescribers also?
Yes, we do. And I've got we do have the distribution on that. There's 11, I believe right now there's 1,100 medical providers registered in the state that are responsible for those 113,000. 1,100. Now, some of the medical providers that recommend to one or two, right? And then there's some that recommend to a lot more. I believe the limit to recommendations is 1,400 now. Utah is the only state that limits the number of patients that a medical provider can recommend to. And for that reason, there's been more participation of medical providers in the program, because if a medical provider reaches their limit and they work at a clinic where it's popular, they're often going to bring in somebody else. And so these companies that have risen up that specialize in medical cannabis recommendations, they are going to hire, some PAs and APRNs to help support that service that they're providing. So if you compare Utah to other states as far as the percentage of medical providers participating in the program, ours is higher because of the fact that we've had that limit of the number of patients that a medical provider can recommend to. Yeah. So, and there's, I think there's about 20 that reach the 1,400 limit, that are very close to it. So there's a few there. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Okay. So this shows the types of conditions that individuals come to their provider talking about. The provider either diagnoses them initially, or maybe there's already been a diagnosis of cancer or PTSD already, and the patient says, yeah, I've been diagnosed, here's documentation about that. The provider asks some questions about that, and then they will notate that diagnosis in our software, and then that way the state can audit and verify that indeed these patients have been diagnosed by their medical provider with the particular condition. That's what we call a qualifying condition in the state of Utah. Other states, some of them don't require that it be a certain medical condition that's on a list. But in Utah, our lawmakers have required that the medical provider, when they're determining if someone should receive a medical cannabis card, that they pick from the list. And there's about 17 conditions that we'll talk about a little bit later. And anyway, so this is the breakdown of where the card holders, the 113,000, are as far as what types of conditions they've been found to have. To become a recommending medical provider, Utah law requires that medical provider hold a specific type of license issued by DOPL, Department of Commerce, Division of Occupational Licensing, right? And so that either must be an MD, a DO, a PA, APRN, or a DPM with a controlled substance license issued by the state. And that coincides with the DEA registered license, right, for controlled substances. So that must be in place. The other is to just complete 4 hours of continuing education specific to medical cannabis through formal or informal sources. And so this would be like an informal source of education. One reason I call it that is because before you leave, in the past, there was a requirement that people that got credit for this would have to pass an exam and prove that they knew what they were learning and had gathered something from it. And beginning this year, there is not that requirement anymore. So you can complete informal education. And so you don't have to prove that you passed an exam after. Anyway, yeah, so that's good. And then every 2 years, there's a requirement that you provide an acknowledgement to the Utah Department of Ag and the Utah Division of Professional Licensing that the education was completed. So you may get questioned about that through an audit or something, and you just acknowledge, yeah, I've completed the education. So 4 hours is the requirement, and it's every 2 years. And as long as someone has done that as a medical provider, they're able to recommend medical cannabis in the state of Utah. And then also an RMP must, the first time they're meeting with a patient and they're recommending medical cannabis, they must have an initial face-to-face appointment with that patient. But the renewals once a year of that recommendation to a patient can be done via telehealth. And also, it has to be done in the setting of a provider-patient relationship. And there's the requirement to complete a medical assessment, which includes just making sure the patient is who they say they are by asking for their government-issued photo ID, and then checking for contraindications in the controlled substance database if there's a medication they're taking that has a contraindication with medical cannabis or with THC. Dr. McIff will cover some of that. That would just be something you would want to check for, right? If it's something that would, for some reason, not be in the best interest of the patient to use THC in combination with this other drug they're taking. And then just considering that patient's qualifying condition, they may have multiple qualifying conditions, right? They might have chronic pain, but that they also might have psychosis or something. And that just might be something to consider before you recommend it. And then just considering the patient's history of substance abuse or opiate use disorder, and considering the patient's history of medical cannabis in controlled substance use, just that's something that the statute actually lists as something that should be considered. And then also the recommending medical provider, you can either document the assessment of that patient in the patient's record, and you optionally can upload that information about that assessment in the EVS, which is our electronic verification system. And you can submit that recommendation to the EVS by logging in, and you set up an ID, and you're able to log in, and you type that information directly into the state system for medical cannabis. Or if someone doesn't want to go through, a medical provider doesn't want to go through all the trouble of, and it's actually not too hard, we've simplified it, but if they just don't want to worry about that, then they can document the assessment in the patient's record and then complete what's called the medical provider recommendation for medical cannabis form. That's on our website. And it's a PDF that you could just print out and fill out manually with a piece of, with a pen, and then you can scan it and you could email it in a secure manner to a medical cannabis pharmacy of the patient's choice, or you could give it to the patient and have them bring it to the medical cannabis pharmacy. And then the medical cannabis pharmacy will enter that information into the EVS system. So no matter what, it all goes into one place, one software that has all of the records of individuals who have been approved by a medical provider for medical cannabis. One reason why that's important is that the state of Utah has a limit on the number of first patients that a medical provider can recommend to, but also the amount of medical cannabis that a patient can buy. And so there's one primary system where all that is tracked, and that's the electronic verification system. So if someone buys from the medical cannabis pharmacy here in Ogden, flower shop, and then they turn around and they buy their limit, and then they turn around and they go to Salt Lake and want to buy from Dragonfly, then they would not be able to, because it's all logged into this system. And if they bought their limit in the flower shop on day one, they can't turn around and buy their limit again. They'd have to wait 28 days in order to buy their monthly limit again. Yeah, so we've talked about the EVS a little bit, and yeah, we've already covered all that. All right, so this is the manual form that a medical provider would print out on our website and fill out. This gives you an idea for the same information that is collected within the EVS system about the patient. So obviously we're first verifying the medical provider with identification numbers, such as the controlled substance license number, similar to like a prescription for a regular controlled substance. You would be required to have that on the prescription. And so that's required to be here. And then we get to the patient information. There's a list of qualifying conditions in a third page. It's not in here because it's not part of the form, but you would be able to check in this appendix for the actual condition that would qualify that person. And also, one of the qualifying conditions is a rare condition as determined by the NIH. So if possible your patient has a rare condition, and you could list it there. And then, yeah, this just goes through patient age and everything. And then dosing guidelines drop down. As a medical provider, you do have the authority to limit what type of product the patient would purchase. It's rare that a medical provider limits that, but they do have the option to do that. And this would be where they would do something like that. So the dosage form, if the physician would want this patient to receive all forms allowed, meaning the physician doesn't want to have a limit, and they're leaving that up to the pharmacist, they indicate that limit, then that's evidence that that authority has been given to the pharmacist to guide that patient. Or you can select one of those, and if if a medical provider just selects concentrated oil, then that would be the only type of product that they could buy. But if they select multiple, like liquid suspension and tablet, then they would just be able to buy whatever is selected there. And then it's possible that not only the product type, but the physician can also limit the amount that patient purchases. So that's where that would happen there. And then if there's any relevant medical or medication history that the physician would want to have put into the software that the pharmacist will see, that would be where you would write that. And then at the pharmacy again, this form would be sent to or given to them physically, and then they would take it and enter all that information into the software. And that way it's stored, and the pharmacist at any of the locations can view that same information regardless of where that patient goes to buy their product. Okay, let's talk about the medical cannabis card application process. So this just talks about that first need for that patient to make an in-person appointment with an RMP to receive a medical cannabis recommendation. So, like I was saying before, that has to be in person. It's possible that a patient has been to a clinic, but the physician that they met with the first time they came in for a card has since left. They're coming back to that same clinic. They would have to meet in person. They wouldn't be able to do it telehealth because that new provider has not met in person with that patient yet. Although they came to the same clinic, it's not the same physician, right? So that's important to keep in mind. And then patients apply for a medical cannabis card. They can do that immediately before or after their medical appointment. A lot of the clinics that have a lot of patients that use medical cannabis that come there, they will enter in that information for the patient. They'll set up their application and everything in the software, and that makes it easier, especially for some patients that might not be tech savvy. It makes it easier for them, obviously. So, but the website that someone would go to apply would be medicalcannabis.utah.gov. And then after that happens, and let's say the recommending medical provider decides that, yeah, this patient qualifies for a card, I believe it's their best interest to try medical cannabis, then that recommending medical provider or RMP would submit the patient's medical cannabis recommendation online. And like I said, they can do that directly in the software if they set up an account, and they can do it outside the software if they're not registered, if they fill out the limited medical provider recommendation for medical cannabis form, and then they email it in a secure manner to the medical cannabis pharmacy. And contact info for all the medical cannabis pharmacies is available on our website. It's just important, of course, that it's done in a secure way, such that patient information is protected and risk is minimized for that information being shared outside of where it should be. So, okay, and then once that happens, the patient pays their $8 application fee online. Sometimes the clinic will pay that and then get reimbursed by the patient for that fee. And then beginning July, like I said, it'll be Utah Department of Ag and Food that reviews and approves the card application. And now it's DHHS, but that duty will move over to that other state agency. And then as long as the requirements are met, the EVS is a smart system that just in an automated fashion issues that medical cannabis card digitally, and it prompts an email to be sent directly to the patient to their email address. And that patient can then use the QR code that will be assigned to their card, that'll appear on the card that'll be emailed to them, and they'll be able to take that to the medical cannabis pharmacy and then show that to the pharmacy, and the pharmacy will know, oh, okay, this is a legitimate patient. And one thing that the EVS system has on the back end is the ability to verify if someone has a card. So just because someone comes and shows that they have this card and it appears like a card, it doesn't mean they're for sure going to be able to buy. The medical cannabis pharmacy on their end has direct access to the EVS system that is like the true verifier of if there's actually a card, a legitimate card issued. So it would not be easy to purchase by committing fraud and creating a fake card.
Is it something they can check, or something that they're required every time to check?
Yeah, so they are required each time at the medical cannabis pharmacy to have that patient produce their card, to scan the QR code, and then that in the digital EVS system verifies on the back end that there indeed is a patient card that's been issued to that person. And also when they show up at the medical cannabis pharmacy, they're required to show their state-issued government ID to show that they indeed, this is a name that matches the card, and Here's the photo of me on my driver's license. Yeah. So a really good question. He just asked, how long is a card good for? And the default is 1 year. But a medical provider can choose to issue for a shorter period if they believe the patient should only receive a card for 6 months or 3 months. The drop-down menu in the software allows the medical provider to exercise that discretion. Most of the time, they're issued for 1 year. That's the default. But that medical provider can always choose to issue it for less time. Now, if it's issued for less time, that does mean that the patient, if it's issued for 6 months, that they would need to pay another $15 fee, or excuse me, $8 fee in 6 months. Rather than it being 1 year, it'll be in 6 months. So that does translate into a slightly higher cost for a 1 year period of having a card, right? Because you're having to renew it in 6 months instead of once a year. But again, that's up to the medical provider to choose. Some medical providers, rather than issuing a card for 1 year or for 6 months, they'll still issue it for 1 year, but then they'll just require that the patient come in every 3 months or every 6 months. And if the patient is missing appointments, then they can always on the back end have the card withdrawn or have their certification withdrawn, and that card is withdrawn and it's canceled. So if the patient, isn't doing their part and coming in for the appointments, that's one way a medical provider could approach it if they're not able to, meet up as often as the medical provider or clinic wants them to. Yeah, the intent here is to make sure that the frequency of the provider meeting with the patient matches that condition, that they would meet with them as often as they would if they weren't using medical cannabis and they were just coming in for chronic pain or for PTSD or for cancer, right? We don't want the medical cannabis just to create this money stream that the medical provider is, milking from the patient. And anyway, yeah. So, okay. A little bit about dosing guidelines. So the recommending medical provider, like I said before, they can include in their recommendation a dosage form, a dosage amount, but those dosing guidelines are optional. Used to be different, now they're optional. So the medical provider is never required to specify like they would in a prescription, okay? And as Dr. McIff can talk about later, there are varying degrees of a medical provider's familiarity with products. And a medical provider, as they begin, they may not be 100% familiar with the best product for their patient. There's a lot more confidence maybe in prescription recommended drugs like FDA drugs, right? You're always going to be really specific in the product that you're having them take. But because of the research nature of medical cannabis and just the reality of the world we live in relation to marijuana, it's just not as often that a medical provider is being really specific about the product or like the brand that they want them to go get. But they always have that option if they want to limit the patient. So if the RMP does not include a dosing guideline, then the pharmacist will determine those in consultation with the patient. One thing that I've noticed is that the pharmacists at the pharmacies, well, I haven't noticed this. The law requires that the first time that patient goes to the pharmacy, they are required to meet with that patient one-on-one and talk to them about the different products. And then after that, the patient always has the option to voluntarily meet with the pharmacist to ask questions. Also, the pharmacist is always available over the phone. If patient doesn't get hold of them, they can leave a message. That the pharmacist in the medical cannabis space is often the one that is most familiar with the actual details of the products being bought. That's just how the ways have operated in Utah in the beginning of the program. Yeah.
So is it optional when the RMP does specify what he wants? Is it optional for the pharmacist to do what the RMP says, or can the pharmacist override?
The pharmacist is limited to whatever the physician is recommending, if there is a limitation. And the software has that evidence of this was what the recommendation was. It operates similar to what a prescription would be, except for a prescription, as you know, is very specific. So the limitation or recommend or a dosing guideline that's in the EVS system is always going to be more general. It's going to say, I'm limiting my patient to buy this amount, or I'm limiting them to this ratio of medical cannabis, of CBD to THC. That's one thing we sometimes see is a ratio of certain cannabinoids to one another. Or also type of product. You could place a restriction that you don't want them to buy a vaping cartridge or a flower product. I only want them to buy tablets or capsules or liquid suspension. So that's always their option. And then if there is a specific recommendation, the pharmacist is required to follow that. And we do audits on the pharmacies and to ensure that's being followed. And if it's not, then we follow up and ask, hey, what happened here? Yeah. Okay. This is what a medical cannabis card looks like. As you can see, it's got the QR code there that's specific to the patient. And then it's got the date it was issued, the expiration, and then if you're the medical provider, your name would show up where it says provider, CMC, QMP. And then there's the contact information for our office and a few warnings. This card, it's only for their purchase of medical cannabis in the state of Utah at Utah medical cannabis pharmacies, right? So there's some states that, well, the states that surround us, most of them are recreational. So you just have to be over a certain age to go buy there. But if they want to buy from a medical program, they would likely, if that state has reciprocity and accepts cards from Utah. Utah accepts medical cannabis cards from other states as long as it's active. And so there's a way someone who is visiting for a short amount of time would be able to buy in Utah if they have a medical card issued in another state. But they would need to apply for what we call a non-resident card, and that's an $8 fee. And the card, if they're coming from out of state, would only be good for 21 days. And you can get it for 2 21-day periods per year if you're coming from out of state. Yeah, so here's what the law states is you can only purchase what the RMP recommended or the state limit every 28 days. So the state limit is this. It's 113 grams by weight of unprocessed flour. Okay, so there wouldn't be, if the patient's only buying flour, okay, they're buying nothing, what I would say are all the other dosage types. If they're only buying flour, then the limit only relates to the grams by weight. It wouldn't relate to the amount of THC that flower has in it. Does that make sense? There's, as you know, there's different strains that have different levels of THC in flower, right? There wouldn't be a limit on how much of the THC would be in the flower, okay? But a separate limit is if they're buying the other dosage types, like liquid suspension, or the most common product that someone buys in Utah is a vaping cartridge, okay? So that we got a 20-gram of composite THC, and all the products that they buy in a 28-day period, those cannot contain more than 20 grams of THC. That's a lot of THC in 28 days. But state lawmakers passed the statute that at least placed that limit. Other states don't have a limit. We do, and that's what it is. And it was a compromise. This is what it's been since the beginning of the program. Yeah. So most other states have recreational programs, right? So you wouldn't need a card to go by there. But some of those states also have a medical program, and there's products that are medical grade that are specifically made for patients in those states. And there are other states that do accept Utah cards if you show that. There's some that do. Yeah. That's a good question. I'm not sure about California. I know they have a medical program. I'd be surprised if they didn't because their program has been around longer than any other program, except for I think it was Colorado that was the first one. So I think California or Washington was the second one. Because they've been around for a while, I would be surprised if they didn't accept Utah cards. But I know the medical programs across the U.S. have suffered quite a bit in their participation because of the recreational market and how cheap it is in a recreational market to buy a product. There's a lot of cheap products that are cheaply made, but they are a lot cheaper than medical products. Companies just have found there's not as much profit in the medical market. Yeah. But in Utah, we're medical only. So in order to sell legally, you'd have to meet the medical standards. Um,
Cheaper than recreation. Why wouldn't it be cheaper than medical?
well, there's in Utah's medical market, there's more regulation than you'd find in a recreational market. For example, Utah requires that a pharmacist be at every location during all hours of operation. And there's actually just one other state that requires that. But there's some value in that. And so that's a cost, though, that they have to cover. Also, more testing happens in Utah than in other states on the products to ensure they're safe and they've got a certain minimum standard that they're all meeting. In other states, it's not so much, but that's another cost that or expense that creates a little more cost in Utah. Yeah, and that's true in other states too, in their medical programs.
You gotta pay the growers, you gotta pay the pharmacist, you gotta pay the pharmacy, you gotta pay all those employees.
Right.
Still that cost built in there.
Right, right. And so one common complaint is, well, I can just still buy from the black market like I always used to and get a good deal, and it's something that's working for me. It calms me, right? But it's a trade-off because you never know what could be coming through that black market as far as safety of the product, what it's laced with. And so people always take a risk, and they took it for many years. So they feel like they won't get caught by law enforcement, then they might just continue to do what they've done in the past.
Are they aggressive in checking, to see that the product is from a pharmacy or not?
Yeah, so the question was, how diligent is law enforcement in checking to see if the product that they might find with a resident is actually a medical product? That's a good question for them. I can't speak for law enforcement. I do know that we get questions once in a while. Some products are sent to the Utah Department of Ag to be tested. And I do know that Department of Ag has, I think, over 500 products over there that they have tested to find out if they're actually, not only if they're state legal, but what's in them, right?
Marijuana, no, it's not. But if it's a vape or something like that, they don't know what all the different vapes are.
Yeah.
So,
Right. Yeah, it's scary, but like I said, people have had a black market for a really long time, and they continue to have a black market. And so anyway, it's unfortunate. And then online sales are a big source of the black market. There's still quite a few that come through that. Yeah.
So, since, medical cannabis has become available in Utah, what has happened to the black market use? Has that been tracked? Can you address, how much the black market, use has gone up or down?
We haven't looked at the overall numbers on that, but what we do know through surveys, this is not scientific, it's self-reported. What we do know is that there are medical cannabis patients in the program. About half of them continue to buy on the black market of the patients that are in the program. So they do a little bit of both. And we try to educate them about the benefits of the legal market, obviously, but there's still a portion of them that choose to buy from the black market. Well, people set up websites all the time that are selling illegal product. It's just they do it, and sometimes they're misleading in how they advertise, and it might be hard for law enforcement to catch them. But we know that sometimes we've found that the product that we're actually getting, it actually has more THC than it says it does. Does that make sense online? Yeah. And it probably has some, if it's a vaping cartridge and it's being bought online, and it's on the black market, then there's probably some filler liquid in there that is not good, that does more harm than good. Yeah. Yeah, one thing that if you do have a patient that is like, hey, CBD is working well for me, and it's possible to buy good CBD without a medical cannabis card. You don't have to have one in order to, you don't have to have a card in order to buy CBD, but you just have to vet the companies that are selling it and make sure that they have some way of verifying with a third party that the product is tested and in a lab and it's done by a party you can trust. So that way you know the patient is buying the actual product that has been tested and is safe.
they're almost always modified vapes,
Yeah,
which is going to be much higher risk online buying THC online vape.
right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a trade-off because they're buying it cheaper. That's true. But if they're used to buying it cheaper earlier in their life or whatever, or their friends are, then that's a factor. But yeah.
Back to your slide here. But if you're in a recreational
cigarettes, or if I want to go and get 20 cartons and share it with my friends, can you do that with marijuana in a recreational state, or are there limits on what people can purchase in recreational?
And some states do have limits. It's interesting though. In medical programs, it's rare because the state wants to protect that patient and allow them to, if they're working with a medical provider and the medical provider signing off on this, they trust the medical provider is watching what that patient is buying. And so it's rare that there's a limit in a medical program, but that state could also have a recreational program that has a limit. I've seen that across the US. Yeah, and there's sometimes a limit per day and sometimes like a limit per month. Those are the two I've seen. And I've seen a limit on THC is sometimes what they do on the total amount of THC. Like we have, total amount of THC for a 28-day period, but some of them have, this is rare, but I've seen like in Connecticut, they've had a limit in a individual product THC.
Personally, or you just walk in and buy, prove it?
If they have a limit, if they want to actually know that the customers are buying under the limit, then they've got to track who's buying, right? But if they don't have a limit, then, I mean, they as a business owner, I would want to track who's coming in if I'm a rec state, right? In a rec state, because I want to market them and I want them to come back as much as possible as a marketing effort, right? So that they know who's coming in and out, right? But they're not sharing that with the state where they are. That's all, private data that they keep for themselves. But in Utah, it's all shared with the state. Yeah.
It's going to be legalized, so people with DUIs and driving.
Uh-huh.
I saw every shift I worked, I saw alcohol related issues. I didn't ever normally see any marijuana issues.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. Yeah. Well, it's similar to your impairment with any other drug. If you're driving impaired and you're pulled over for that, and then they test you and you come positive, then that's going to be used as evidence against the individual, even if they have a medical card, because the issue is not, the exact drug you're taking. It's you have to be driving impaired. There has to be some evidence. Yeah, why did they pull someone over, right? Are they driving impaired? Or are they, you know, yeah, right. Yeah. And that could be a part of it. I can't speak for law enforcement, but that might aggravate the circumstance potentially. But back to your comment, I was just thinking of, Dr. McIff has seen this. I've seen this just in the reports, is that the types of products that are bought today are a lot different than 20, 30 years ago, right? So a lot of it was flour back then, right? The manufacturing was not as efficient, and the marketing was different. So today, the products that they market will intentionally have a extremely high amount of THC, like in a dab that's legal, or a vaping cartridge. You can have a very highly potent THC product. For some patients, that's legitimate, but For a lot of others, it's not. And they are high on marijuana, and the product that they're taking, if they're, a lot of what impacts it is if it's heavy use, right? If it's one use, two uses throughout a day, but if it's like frequent, then that increases the impact of on that individual, obviously, on their impairment. And if it's a low level of THC, then it's found there's not as much of an issue on impairment. But if it's a high amount, that it's the THC that creates the psychoactivity in the individual that causes them to be impaired in a way that could interact with their, if they have a psychotic issue, that we'll talk about that more with Dr. McIff. But I think that that's something to be aware of for physicians, is to watch what product they're buying. And that's another thing is, as a physician, if you've recommended medical cannabis, you can go in and you can see the products that they've bought. And beginning in July, it'll be possible for physicians to be able to, if they're not even participating in the program, for any prescriber to go in and see what products their patient has purchased. Even if the physician is not recommending the medical cannabis, they'll be able to click on a tab in the controlled substance database is where they'll be able to do it. Because you can do that for any controlled substance now. Now it's going to have this new feature of medical cannabis as well. So, but there's a lot of physicians and prescribers that maybe don't know a lot about the program, may not be able to understand what a certain term means in the description of the product. So it may be good for them to reach out to the actual medical cannabis pharmacy to ask more about that type of product, or to contact the processor. That's more work, but as you know, there's not studies on these individual products that are being bought. They're all manufactured in the state of Utah, and there's not the quality control that you'd see by a major FDA-approved drug, right? So that's a limit that you just have to keep in mind if you're trying to understand what type of product your patient is buying. But we'll send out a notice to medical providers when that new feature in the controlled substance database becomes available, and that way they can know when to do it. Yeah.
If it's there, does it ever fall off if they don't renew their card? Or once it's there, it's there? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah. So it stays there. Yeah. And then in July, there will be a module that the medical providers will be able to go into to actually see the purchase history. Yeah. Good question. Okay. Compassionate use board, we don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but this is where if you're under age 21, but the other group that goes here are those that are adults, but who don't have a qualifying condition. They are still able to get a card if their medical provider submits a petition and makes a case for them being able to get medical cannabis despite them not having one of the qualifying conditions. So that's happened in a few isolated cases. Yeah. Yeah, and the evidence is mixed, and Dr. McIff can talk about that a little bit. There's reasons why it might counteract, but for some it has been helpful, and for sleep, and that's not a qualifying condition, but for some it's something that helps them. Yeah.
Meta-analysis published in the Lancet, just reported on in the Deseret News today, that said that there's no convincing evidence that it helps with anxiety, depression, or PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm sure you're going to talk about some of this, but
Yeah.
it makes it difficult.
It does. And So yeah, Dr. McIff can cover there's evidence out there. Like I said, it's mixed. And so it's something to keep in mind as you just know that the medical cannabis program, it doesn't run without physicians that act as a gatekeeper in our state. So there's a lot of responsibility that's held by the physicians to ensure that, just like controlled substances, any controlled substance, they have to get a prescription before they get access. So here's all the dosage forms that are allowable in Utah. This shows the trend of what types of products patients are buying over time in the program. Yeah. So typical routes. On the left, you got the legal name of that product and then the legal dosage form examples, and then the typical routes of administration. It's the same. Yeah, it's like a gummy, right? Gelatinous cube is just the legal term. Yeah. And in Utah, it has to be a square shape or a rectangle shape. It can't be like a gummy bear shape. It can have a flavor. Uh-huh. Yeah, in fact, I've got a few examples here. Here's this is the packaging, excuse me. Yeah. So this is the packaging that's used, and this one is cherry, so cannabis infused. And then you can come look at the warning that's on the products that tells you the cultivator of where or the manufacturer of that gummy. And there's a warning that it contains THC on the back. But I'll leave these here. Okay. So here's a list of the medical cannabis pharmacies that are throughout the state. And Boojum at the bottom, it doesn't show because of the slide, the way it's set up, but Boojum is going to be located in Moab at the end of 2026. So that's another one of the only rural located facilities. Okay. I've already covered some of this in here. You can't offer samples. I was testing you earlier. All right. And then, yeah, each facility has to have a pharmacist there. They review every medical cannabis transaction. And then the voucher program is brand new. Now, insurance does not help any patient buy medical cannabis because of its status federally. It's not allowed. But what the legislature did during the last session is they required that the Utah Department of Ag and Food create what's called a voucher program. And it allows Utah Department of Ag to contract with a nonprofit who will provide eligible patients with monthly $150 vouchers for purchasing medical cannabis at the medical cannabis pharmacies. The person has to be an active medical cannabis card holder and enrolled in Medicaid or Medicare to apply. So there'll be a verification of that Medicaid or Medicare, and then they could have that $150 voucher. So that program has not launched yet. It'll launch later this year. Yeah. 2 products, likely. Well, I would, it depends. It depends on what type of product. If you're buying flour, it can go farther. Vaping cartridges, yeah, it can go farther. But if you're buying some of the other products, gummies might be a little more expensive, but they're popular. So also the level of THC, often those type of products will cost more. But yeah, $150, that can buy you, like 2 or 3 vape cartridges. Yeah. Okay. And then if you need to contact our agency, that's our contact info. But in the new program that'll start in July, it'll be Department of Ag that'll be the resource. And so their email is cannabis@utah.gov. instead of medical cannabis. But actually, I think they're going to continue to use that same one since we've used it in the past. So anyway, if you go online, you'll be able to find what that new information will be in July. But I need to transfer things over to Dr. McIff so he can get started. Go ahead. Yeah. So we already know a little bit, and what's already started is that the facilities in Utah that sell medical cannabis to patients are being asked to register with the federal, with the DEA, just like a pharmacy, regular pharmacy does for like a Walgreens. Now, that's just barely being launched. Um, and so there's a lot to be worked out, a lot of detail to be worked out, like crossing state lines and all of that. But this is something that is only for medical programs. It is not for recreational programs. It's only for medical. Yeah. Well, yeah. I would think that they'll find an avenue to allow people to be able to access medical products just like they do other FDA drugs. Well, I mean, everybody, they've always had access to other controlled substances, pilots. They've always had access, right? So the principle I'm sharing is if they have access to those, and if it's medical cannabis, then why should they be restricted? If it's medical and they're doing it with a physician recommendation. So that's just how the feds may approach it in the future. Um, they're trying to, they've shown signs of treating it similar. It's just they aren't FDA approved products, and it takes years to get an FDA approved product. So, but what they've started is for the first time, they've created this system for registration of the facilities that sell them for the very first time. So we'll see where they go. There is not guidance beyond that right now. Um, it's under federal law, they have the ability to reschedule, and that's what they've done. They've 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 done an order to reschedule medical marijuana. It's not recreational, medical only. But they're starting. It can't be. They're starting it. They've kicked off the concept, but the issue is that right now, whether a facility is federally registered or not is not known. Like it's barely like it started at the beginning of this month actually is when they started licensing these facilities or excuse me, registering for the very first time. And it's yet to be known what additional actions they'll choose to take. There's guidance that has not been given yet. And as we have asked questions, us and other states, there's not been any answers. So there's not a lot of more information that's available. So that's why technically it's still a federally illegal product, but in the future that could change because of the federal order and what's been put into place. It's moving toward allowing medical products to be allowed, but the federal registration has just kicked off. So they can't say, okay, we're going to go and arrest all those patients because your facilities aren't registered yet. They're not doing that. It's like an incremental kickoff. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. No, yeah, the feds do have the authority um, to reschedule medicine to what it was in the past. They have the authority to reschedule it. And then what they've created is a federal order that says medical products that are in a medical only products, that those are legal, but they've just barely kicked it off. So it's not, there'll be more guidance that'll come out later on about it. Yeah. And I better go to Dr. McIff. Yeah. Does yours work?
Hopefully that's working. Is that working? Awesome. Does anyone want to take a break real quick? Or you just want to plow forward?
I'll stick around in case there's additional questions.
What's that?
Bruce McIff, the oldest.
He's my uncle. Yeah, so I'm glad to be here. My name is Dr. Matt McIff. Bruce McIff is my uncle, if you know him. And it's fun to be here. I'm a family medicine physician in St. George. Just came up this morning, so I am tired already. How many of you were here last year? I know there's front row. We should be friends because so you were here last year as well? Yeah, I recognize a lot of you. How many here are qualified medical providers or prescribed cannabis already? So a handful. How many have done any training prior to this? So maybe half. Okay, so this is our third year here. Rich and I have done this is the third time. And our presentation has evolved a little bit. Obviously, we have updates. So some of it is review, some of it's a little bit new. So I hope not to be too repetitious with some of the things, and some of it's on a very basic level. But maybe the approach I would like to take today is not only best practice on clinical medical cannabis, because I'm no expert. I don't do research in it. I'm a clinician just like most of you, and some of my medical cannabis patients are my favorites because it's been very positive. My experience has been very positive, and I like to share that. But maybe the approach a little bit today too is not just best practice, but maybe train the trainer approach. How many of you take medical students in your clinics? Not enough. I like to teach medical students and talk to my partners because, as you can see, medical cannabis is growing, and a lot of us, well, this wasn't part of our medical training, but yet it's here and it cannot be ignored anymore. And so that's a lot of the theme and the approach that I've taken is it's here whether you like it or not, or whether you prescribe it or not. And I have a couple of new stories and a couple new experiences that I'd like to share. But let's at least carry on. I don't know if I had enough of an introduction. Like I say, I'm family medicine. Because I became involved with patients, I gave a grand rounds in our primary care group, and my leader said, "Hey, why don't he liked it? So why don't you get involved?" And so he invited me to join the Department of Health in their research review board. It's now been transferred to the University of Utah, but the Department of Health just collected a bunch of pharmacists and physicians and decided, hey, now that we have a program in Utah, let's review research across the country and start gathering more and more data because this is in flux, right? Cannabis has been around for a long time, but we don't have a lot of quality research. We have some, and then it's also really hard to research. It's a cultivated product with, until recently, federally illegal. It takes money to research, so there's a paucity of good research, and so, but it's changing, and so we need to constantly review it and update it. So that was the effort, and so that was really interesting. So that's how I got involved and started teaching. But again, my background is really clinical experience with patients, and it's been very positive thus far. So here's kind of a list of things we want to review today. Like I say, the cannabis use is growing. We need education. I always like to start with the endocannabinoid system and then areas of concern, the products, and then just the medical assessment. How do we talk to patients? How do we talk to other providers or students? So here's the graphic from this study. I actually printed the link down here, National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics. So I printed it off. It's really a good little short article talking about up-to-date data. So as you can see there, almost half of the population has tried cannabis at least once. 61.5 million Americans, or 23.4% of American adults, used marijuana in 2024. So that's just during 1 year. 51% of American adults have tried marijuana at least once. 26% of 12th graders used marijuana at least once in 2025. So this is recent data, and kind of underlines my point. We can't ignore this as, well, how many are in primary care here? Good. So again, this is for anyone, but really, I'm passionate about primary care, and this, when a quarter of your high school seniors have used it, this is relevant. Marijuana use has surged over the past decade, rising in an estimated 65% between 2015 and 2024. Overall, illicit drug use has increased by 54% between 2015 and 2024. Rates of substance use disorder involving marijuana were 3.7 times higher in 2024 than in 2015. So those are just a few tidbits of information to underline the importance of this topic. Whether you end up prescribing or not is not the point. We all need to be aware and cognizant of this impact on our patients and our society at large.
Especially in the 60s, late 60s, was pretty prevalent on college campuses. Was there a double spike, or is it a lower?
That it's lower on college campuses?
It was quite prevalent in the 60s.
Yes. So I might move around a little bit because I have actually kind of hard of hearing, so it's really hard for me to hear questions, but I appreciate them nonetheless. Okay, so we keep growing in our use. The top line is new cards activated per month. These ones are expired per month, but I don't know how much of that data is. I have a lot of my patients that let it expire because they forget, and then they ask for a renewal. But at least the overall trend is increasing significantly since 2020, when it began. And then over here, this is interesting. The majority of our providers in Utah are nurse practitioners, APRNs. I don't know the reason for that. MDs, DOs, and PAs. So that's the sort of the distribution of our provider mix, which I find interesting. Okay, so here's another good study. Dr. Russo.
NPs and doctors in the state, what's the percentage?
Of actual providers in the state?
Are the NPs overrepresented?
I don't know. I mean, they're obviously, yeah, but that would be interesting. But I just give a shout out to MPs, like they're taking the responsibility.
When I came to this class, I'm not sure what I'm getting out of this class, but you've presented a lot of data about substance use disorder in your opening statement, but you're also rah-rah for prescribing. What am I going to get at the end of your lecture? Not
Okay.
being blunt with this.
So I'll give you a quick answer, but then let's let it proceed, okay? So what I'm here for is education. I'm not rah-rah or against. I'm about education, because there's so much of this that has not been given in our training, and it needs to be. Okay. So Dr. Russo is a doctor in California who's really involved. He's a neurologist involved in cannabis research and education. And he has a lot of productions, and he's part of the Marijuana 411 education, which I really do like for their training. And there's this study of healthcare providers' lack of confidence, again, because of, well, inexperience, lack of training, whatever the case may be. So patients are turning a lot to social media for information. A lot of providers are just hesitant, whether it's regulatory constraints or policies like we've been talking about. And that's what I feel like we need to improve. We need to improve our confidence in talking about this subject. So where do they get advice? Well, number one was their own experience, or they just try it themselves, right? From wherever they get it. Pharmacists, this is the Department of Health data. So these are from patients, right, that have been registered or that responded to the survey. So there we are in the middle, recommending a medical provider. We're growing in our ability to give information, but there's still a wide breadth of sources people are getting information from. When the patients were polled about what they were talked about, well, this is good. I mean, driving avoidance was number one, but look at the top three: possible side effects, recommend methods of use, how often to use. So those are a very appropriate topics to talk about when you're doing a medical cannabis assessment. Well, obviously we're going to talk about how to use, recommended indications, but then also the safety, because that's what we want. We want safe use of these products. Okay, so I always like to start with this when I talk to patients about it, because I think it's good to start with just a basic physiologic starting point, and mentioning the history, because cannabis has a long, sordid history, right? But at least start with three facts. So in 1964, Dr. Meshulam in Israel was the one who discovered THC, and then later CBD. And that was significant, right? Because it was used a lot. It's been used for hundreds of years, thousands of years, but at least in modern medicine, this is kind of when we identified these cannabinoids and the substances. And then later in 1988, an American chemist isolated the receptors in the brain. And that was significant, right? CB1 and CB2 receptors. And that was really significant because then Dr. Meshulam realized, well, gosh, wait a minute. We don't make receptors to plant antigens. There must be an endocannabinoid. We must have endocannabinoids in the brain. So later they discovered anandamide, which is analogous to THC, and then CBD, which is 2-arachidonyl-glycerol, 2-AG, which is analogous to CBD. I find these very significant because then it underlines, and I share this with patients, it underlines the fact that, well, we have an endocannabinoid system. It was previously assumed that cannabinoids attach to GABA receptors or other receptors in the brain because it wasn't studied, it wasn't investigated properly, and so assumptions were made. Assumptions were made that it would cause respiratory suppression, just like benzos and opiates together, but it does not. And so I find these very significant and a good starting point to start talking about this, to start the conversation. And then it begs the question, well, if we have an endocannabinoid system, then what is it for? What is its purpose? And in a word, you might say homeostasis. Homeostasis and maybe neuroprotection, right? It's a master regulatory system of the body. And so when I introduce that concept, it's to say, gosh, cannabis can be used why does it have 15 indications? How many drugs in our pharmacopoeia have 15 indications? Not many, right? So it's to introduce the concept of cannabis as a medicine isn't a great medicine for one thing. It's a decent medicine for lots of things. And I want to introduce those expectations in a patient right away. This isn't a miracle drug like some proponents of it would lead you to believe. But it can be useful for several different things. And so that's, I think, a very important foundation to lay with a patient, especially if they're new to it, is what can we expect from this treatment? We'll get to the side effects and the dangers and the risks, but also for its therapeutic benefits, what can we expect? So that's why it can be helpful for pain, nausea, seizures, muscle spasm, because it regulates those other neural pathways in that way. So that's what we talked about. We're trying to regulate other things, achieve homeostasis. It's a broad treatment. It's usually secondary therapy or adjunct treatment. Usually not a primary treatment. Okay, so the symptoms. So this list, the 3 major starting points for treatment, at least medical. This comes from the National Academy Press 2017 manual. I have this manual. It's pretty thick. It was the National Academy's attempt to sort of collect all the data we have on cannabis and put it in one sort of, it's not really a textbook, but it is a collection. How many have this book? Have you seen this book? Well, now it's almost 10 years old, but it was sort of the authority in 2017 about what we know so far about legitimate research in cannabis. So, of course, it talked about nausea and vomiting as an antiemetic. It talked about chronic pain, and it talked about MS and muscle symptoms related to MS. How many people have MS patients that are using cannabis in here? Just a couple? I have a couple, and they really benefit. It's one of the conditions that we have some of the best evidence for. When we reviewed evidence and posted it on the Department of Health website, that's some of the highest quality evidence we have is for MS. MS patients will often describe the MS hug. Have you guys heard of the MS hug? They'll describe this pain, this feeling that they're being bear hugged. And so they get this pain, across their chest. And it just, so I had a patient I saw this week. I saw him on Tuesday. He said, yeah, when I feel that, I vape. He was already using before he came to me, but he said, yeah, it really relaxes that pain for me. It's really quite interesting. Okay, so here's just a list of some common side effects, some of the negatives, right? And so they vary from person to person, but this is story time. So I want to talk about a story that happened to me this year. It's been really interesting. So I got a new patient established with me a few months ago, probably late 50s. I didn't bring all the details. A late 50, maybe 58-year-old man establishes care, and he's telling me his whole story and all these things he's dealing with. He has paroxysmal tachycardia that got more and more severe. So now he has a cardiologist, and he's on medicine, more than just metoprolol. I think he's on flecainide or something, and they had risk of AFib and all these cardiology issues that he was talking about, and he has a cardiologist. And as he's telling me this story, and I'm learning all the issues that he deals with, I see he has tattoos. He's wearing shorts. He has tattoos all over his legs. And he had this tattoo of this cannabis plant on his knee. I think, okay, well, I kind of want to find out more. So toward the end of the visit, I said, well, tell me, do you use cannabis? I see this tattoo. What do you use that very much? He's like, oh yeah, I use it a lot actually. I use it for PTSD and then recreationally. And as we know now, PTSD, if you saw from Rich's slide, is the second most common use. And but we also don't have much data. And nowadays, PTSD is self-diagnosed. I don't know how much of the time, but it's another issue that we need to deal with. But anyway, he uses a lot. And I say, well, what kind of products do you use? And he vapes, and it's very high THC content. Usually vape cartridges are like that. They don't have a very good ratio of THC to CBD. It's usually high THC, and tachycardia is one of the biggest side effects of that. So we started talking about that, and I said, I want you to do an experiment for me. I want you to, I told him that's one of the potential risks with his heart condition. So I said, for the next month, would you buy only a more balanced ratio, like gummy? He uses vape and gummies. So I said, why don't you for a month just try only gummies of a matched ratio, THC, CBD, 1 to 1, and see what your month is like. I saw him 2 months later, or 2.5 months later, and this was just last month. He said, "You're right. My episodes went way down, over half reduction in my episodes of tachycardia." And he was really pleased. He was really pleased. And I felt really, well, I was pleased that I could help him in that way just by inquiring. This is, and knowing that, his cardiologist doesn't know that. And that's kind of my point, is we all would benefit from increasing our knowledge, because patients are using, whether we know it or not, or whether we're prescribing it or not, it's here. And the more educated we could all be, maybe we could really help patients in different ways. And that was an interesting experience I had. So moving on to youth, young people. We talked about college students. We talked about college seniors. I think this is a real issue to grapple with. Young people are more impetuous. They're more likely to use. They're more likely to experiment. They're more likely to use recreationally. But the effects it could have on their, well, just their physical brain development. We know that cannabis can downregulate that development. It does develop a higher risk of mental disorders like psychosis and psychotic symptoms, paranoia, anxiety. These are well documented. And that's just the physical. There's much more to this concept that's listed here, the psychosocial development and their emotional development. Yes?
I read the Lancet article before, and they said there's 3 articles now that show that 25%, no, 1/3 of all schizophrenic is directly related to the use of marijuana now. So you need to tell your patient that they are high risk for schizophrenia.
Totally. Pardon?
You said high risk for something?
For schizophrenia, psychosis. So this leads me to my next story. Let's do it before we talk about that. So my next story, this week, Monday, one of my partners is on medical leave. So I saw this patient. So think about this, 26-year-old girl comes in, not sleeping well. I don't know her because I'm covering. So the story is she is really anxious, got a lot of anxiety. Last November, she started hearing voices. She started having some psychotic symptoms. And so she was given Xanax for panic attacks. She also had panic attacks. And so I don't know when she started Xanax, but in November, she was prescribed Risperdal. So Risperdal from November to now. Yes, her voices went down, her psychotic symptoms decreased, but this wasn't even me. She told me, she said, "I think it was my cannabis use because I was using a lot." And I said, "What kind of use?" "Oh yeah, high dose THC every day." And apparently this was not discussed back in November. It's like, "Oh, you're having voices and your anxiety? Well, here's some Risperdal." And so she said, after I stopped using cannabis, because I had read or heard somewhere that could make it worse, they're gone. They're gone. I'm still not sleeping well, but anxiety, but they're gone. It's like, oh, great. So she figured it out on her own. So I said, well, you don't need Risperdal then. Like this is a known side effect of high dose or continuous cannabis use with high dose THC. In fact, so anyway, we took her off Risperdal. We took her, she's going to leave cannabis alone, still have Xanax. What about good old Prozac? I mean, you know what? Good old Prozac is good for anxiety and panic attacks, reducing their frequency. There's a really great study. I don't have it on a slide on this, but they did a study in Amsterdam, Paris, and London concurrently, talking about psychosis related to cannabis. And it's really great. They had six groups and then a control group. The 6 groups, one half was high dose THC use, and the 3 groups were 2 or 3 times a month, 2 or 3 times a week, or every day. And then they had a low dose THC or a balanced THC CBD products, and then again, 2 or 3 times a month, 2 or 3 times a week, or every day. Well, I don't think it would be hard for you guys to guess which one, and they measured rates of psychosis against the control group. And there was a varying level among 5 of the groups. Which group do you think had high level of psychosis? Like the graph is impressive. There's just, you know, sort of an up, down, and then a huge bar graph of rates of psychosis. High dose THC every day, right? That to all of us, like, that's no surprise, but it had to be documented. It had to be shown, and these studies are really a great study that to show that. In 3 places where cannabis use is very, very high, Amsterdam, Paris, and London. So we need to know that. We need to watch for that. Kudos to this patient. She discovered it on her own. Cannabis use disorder. Again, young people. Overall, general population, there's about a 10% risk of cannabis use disorder for patients using, but much higher the younger they are. And for various reasons, right? This is just an observational study. There'd be lots of reasons for that, but fact remains when we're considering patients or seeing patients, there's a huge difference between someone in their 20s and someone in their 60s with arthritis who wants to try cannabis. Huge difference. Drug-drug interaction, yeah, so interaction checker, we kind of listed, there are lots of drugs that potentially could interact. This was one of the benefits from the 80s when they did all the FDA approval for Marinol and the synthetic THC back then. They did all this work to see what kind of interactions there are. There aren't that many serious ones. I mean, mostly it's additive effects with other CNS depressants or sedatives. I mean, that stands to reason. And then everything interacts with warfarin, so no surprise there, right? Contraindications, we talked about psychosis and schizophrenia. Bad idea. Cardiac conditions, we talked about that. Tachycardia or other unstable cardiac conditions you've got to watch out for. Immunosuppression, well, yeah, I don't know how, we don't really have a measurement of how much cannabis can cause immunosuppression. There is some evidence that it does, but how do you measure that? Like, how do you measure that against prednisone or other drugs? I think it's probably minor, but at least it should be taken into account. Pregnancy, small for gestational age. I have a patient who continued to use during pregnancy despite my warning. Baby was born very, very small. Luckily, a baby has caught up, but delivered early, very small for gestational age, and had difficulty feeding for the first 4 months. Very difficult. And of course, history of reactions. We just talked about that, high dose THC. And most of the research we have for medical indications for cannabis, it's the CBD that works. But like Rich said, you can get CBD anywhere, but it's just not that potent. And so there's this complicated interplay between THC and CBD. THC activating the receptors and activating that system, but then CBD providing a lot of the benefit. So when I talk to patients, it's an oversimplification, but I say, you know, it's kind of like bread. Bread is mostly flour, but you've got to have some yeast. You know, you got to have some yeast to create that reaction. Yeah, that's way oversimplified, but it kind of gets in their mind that the THC is necessary, but we want to match that ratio with CBD or even exceed it with CBD so that you get most of the therapeutic benefits and you temper or mitigate the side effects or the psychoactivity of the THC. And that's where we're safe. That's because a lot of the patients who are new to cannabis are very concerned about the safety. Okay, products. Yeah, so this is partly for your benefit or your reference later. Whole flower is very popular, I think mostly because it's cheap. And then those who want to smoke it, like Rich said, it's still illegal in Utah to smoke it. Many do, despite our admonition not to. But the idea behind regulation and freedom is, well, they can process it themselves, with the whole flower, however they choose. But it is the cheapest. And then you can't vary the ratio. The ratio of the cannabinoids is whatever the flower has naturally, which may be pros and cons to that. And then you got topicals. Topicals they're mild, but some of my patients swear by their knee pain, a topical, if it's prepared right. Cannabinoids are large molecules, so it's got to be really prepared right in the cream to be absorbed. Edibles are the favorite, at least with us prescribing, because it's fixed ratios, fixed dosing, predictable. There are a lot of benefits to it, but the downside is it takes a while, and you got to warn them. You got to wait 2 hours. I had some people dose again because they didn't feel anything, and then 2 hours later they were totally high, and they didn't like that. So you got to make sure they understand that. And then it does matter. Eating it with more fat, butter or other high-fat foods will increase absorption. I also like tinctures. I wish tinctures worked faster. I like the idea that it looks like medicine, tastes like medicine. It's easy to regulate the amounts, the dose. You can theoretically absorb it in the mucous membranes. It's still not that much faster than edibles, so a lot of patients don't prefer it, but it is a good option. Vapes, like Rich said, vapes have become the most popular. And there might be many reasons for that. You do get fast absorption, so people with seizures or other conditions where they want sort of an immediate effect prefer that. We always like to counsel them against, lung injury or all the problems with vaping. And then a lot of the vape cartridges, the way they list the THC content is by percentage. So we still don't have a standard nomenclature for reporting. I mean, they do have good certificates of authentication about what's in it, but there's not really a standard per se. Okay. So safe practice. Not first line treatment, qualifying condition, adjunct therapy, set good expectations, carefully screen patients, talk to them, make sure that you're doing this with good communication, and then set treatment goals, follow-up expectations, all those kind of things are so important, because then you become a partnership through this, because there's so many unknowns in this kind of treatment that we really want to partner with them. Check for contraindications, other medications, follow-up care. So this is a lot for reference. A lot of this is not complicated. I kind of want to just get to questions so that we have time. Create a safe space. This is one of my points I've made in the past. I want them to feel comfortable talking about this. I've had a couple of patients, when I brought it up, they thought, I didn't know I could talk about that here. I thought you were all against it. And some medical providers are. And so I want to make sure we develop that trust so that we can talk about those things. The guy with the tattoo on his knee, he was kind of blown away that I caught him by surprise anyway. Tracking, talk about products. I find that trying to achieve, I don't limit very much when I prescribe it, especially if they're older. Maybe if they're in their 20s, I do put a limit on what they can use. I know we have the power like Rich talked about. I don't do it very often because I want them to be able to self-regulate. I want to be able to communicate so well that they know, and I don't have to put limits. But that's to our discretion, and that's what we can sort of achieve with our patients one by one. Okay, cool. So again, I'm hard of hearing, so I might come to you a little bit.
THC that causes for neuropathic pain, is it the THC that's effective at blocking the pain, or is it the cannabinoids, the other ones?
It's a great question.
Do we know that?
I don't know that there's a simple answer to that. Because I'm no neurologist.
The ACOM guidelines that will be coming out this fall are to not use it for neuropathic pain.
Is that right?
And that will become part of OGD within a year.
So these are great questions, and I'm sorry that I don't always have the answers because there's so many of the detailed science that we don't have. Again, it kind of feels like we're just in uncharted waters, right? And we're navigating this together. Because I find that it's not as useful for neuropathic pain. But then again, a lot of people with different pain syndromes have more than one thing, right? How many patients just have one source of pain when they have back pain? You know, it's usually part musculoskeletal, part nerve impingement, maybe some neuropathic pain. So it gets muddy. But I don't find that so the answer is I don't know. And I don't find that it's really that useful compared to maybe gabapentin or some of these, Lyrica and some of these other things that we already have.
Comment with the, and I read this article about the FDA rescheduling it, and I don't know if that's gonna, or the president rescheduling it, and I don't know if that's gonna then require a congressional law to make it a permanent thing. But I think if I heard they rescheduled it to a Schedule 3, which kind of surprised me, because that's sort of a lower risk than morphine and stuff like that. But my hope is that with that change, there will now be some legitimate hardcore studies, both from the basic science level and biochemical level and physiologic level, all the way up to the clinical level, that might give us some guidance. And I recognize that there are patients who are very convinced they've been helped. They probably have. And you're on the front line of that, and you would know better than I. The history of our profession is full of things that worked because they work. And then later on we found out, oh, well, they really don't work, or they have bad side effects. And so to me, I tend to want to take a more cautious approach. Say, let some of this research play out, and it may take 5 or 10 or 15 years. And
Yeah.
we can do some better guidelines, and maybe much of this use will be thrown out, or maybe there will be legitimate uses, but dosing will be worked out. I'm a little uncomfortable. My wife has chronic pain, and we discussed with her pain doctor about her getting it. And so it was prescribed, and we picked up one of it here at the local flower shop, I think in South Ogden. Turns out her other medicine started working a little better. She never needed it. It's sitting in a sack up on the top of my shelf. It's been there for over a year. I probably need to burn it or something. Stay away from my burner. But the thing is that it was the pharmacist who was sort of deciding, well, we want to give this, and there were funny names. I mean, like or whatever, and and we'll give this. We should do this maybe twice a day, and this one when the pain is worse. And it made me uncomfortable that a pharmacist was the one giving the doses rather than the physician knowing enough about it to not be able to give the doses. And I mean, I recognize this because we don't know about it. But
yeah. So I like some of those points that you made. I think one of the biggest benefits of rescheduling it is not as much regulation as much as research. It'll open up the doors and maybe funding to let's get some more data, because it's hard to study. It's a cultivated product. What do we need for good research? We need a consistent product, consistent indication, and a controlled, blinded, complete placebo-controlled. That's really hard. How do you blind a study like this? Because they're going to have some effects no matter what. So it's really difficult to get good data, but we want it because people are using it, and we need some guidance and direction. Think about this, another way to look at it. If you prescribe hydrocodone or gabapentin, well, what do you have? You had dose and you have frequency. Like, that's it. Maybe indication on some of those. 2 variables. Well, cannabis, you've got dose and you've got frequency, but you've also got, well, what plant, indica versus sativa? It makes a big difference. And then what ratio of THC and CBD are you using? And then what route? The route matters, whether it's a tincture, a gummy, or a vape. And then the indication, because it's, again, there are 15 indications in Utah. And that matters what ratio you use for what indication. So you've got 6 variables, and yet they're supposed to navigate it on their own. Like, no, they need help, and we need help. So that's why I'm really just want to promote education and research and guidance and all of that.
The big study that was, it's hard, you can't do research on an illegal drug in America.
Right.
It was done in Europe. And the one study that became the basis for all the pain treatment has been shown to be totally bogus. It's been vigorously attacked in the last year. And that's where this whole recommendation is don't use for pain.
Oh yeah, and like you mentioned, is it really their pain that got better? Or do they just experience enough euphoria and calmness that they just feel better about it, right? So when I have patients come back, and I set their expectation, but when they come back and report, they always tell me the same thing. Well, I still have pain, but I can manage. I can deal with it. I can cope. I can get by. I can function. Like every iteration of that phrase is what they tell me. And I sleep better. Well, that's what I don't know. So, but they tell me the same thing. I can function at least, and I'm sleeping way better. And if you fix someone's sleep, their whole life gets better. Think about your sleep apnea patients. I mean, so I don't know if it's actually their pain perception or we're achieving a therapeutic benefit some other way. Either way, they're doing better and they're functioning. So that's what I like to see. But it'd be nice to know what are we actually doing versus not.
Kind of a practical approach. You say you limit it kind of in your patients that are in their 20s or not. What's kind of your gram limits that you set on those patients? What's kind of the amount that you set it for those?
Oh, I don't know. I don't really know if I have one. I kind of assess them, like, why are you using? Because you think about
like 60 grams a month or something, or what?
something like that.
Something like that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of go with the flow because I just want to, that's part of the assessment. So you're 20 years old. Why are you using? What do you need? In fact, I really rarely do it. I kind of screen them out like, no, if you're under 25, I really don't. Now, it's just my discretion. In Utah, it's legal if you're 21. But it's my discretion to say, you know what, you'd have to be really convincing for me to give you a card, I'd have to. But that's part of that assessment. It's like, okay, so if I find that you have a legitimate use, what are our boundaries? Because like to his point, how much are you just treating your condition versus you just want to avoid? How much of our anxiety or treatments for anxiety or people with mental health are just avoidant behavior? Right? How much mental health is just avoidant behavior because they don't want to go through the pain of therapy and dealing with their PTSD or dealing with their depression. They just want to avoid it. And how many drugs that we have will just help people avoid life? And so that's part of that assessment for me. Did you have a comment? Are you just moving? Well, thank you all for listening. And again, I think this is a really important topic. Like I said before, I've had a very positive experience. I'm no expert, but I am passionate about clinical medicine and primary care and education. So hopefully this was helpful. I really learned from and enjoy these discussions.